Section 24 of The American Beaver and His Works by Lewis Henry Morgan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Deon, Salt Lake City, Utah. Chapter 9, Animal Psychology, Part 1. The popular mind has always been in advance of the metaphysicians with reference to the mental endowments of animals. For some reason, there has been a perpetual hesitation among many of the latter to recognize in the manifestations of the animal mind the same characteristics that are displayed by the human intellect, lest the high position of man should be shaken or impaired. Besides this, the connection in man between the intellectual faculties and the moral sense is found to be so intimate that the concession of the former has seemed, to cautious minds, to draw after it the necessary admission of the latter. In attempting to escape this imaginary dilemma, the metaphysicians have been betrayed, as it would seem, into a false position. This is shown by the invention in modern times of a vague, not to say fictitious, principle with which all animals have been arbitrarily endowed for the government and maintenance of their lives. There can be no objection to the use of this principle, which is termed instinct, to explain, or rather to leave unexplained, certain mental phenomena exhibited equally by mankind and the inferior animals, so long as it is restricted to those mental processes which are beyond the reach of consciousness. But the attempt to explain all the mental phenomena manifested by the mutes by means of an arbitrary term is an invasion of the true question involved. It would be difficult, in right reason, to discover the slightest tendency to lower the personal dignity of man, or to alter in the least his responsibility to God, by recognizing the existence in the mutes of a thinking, self-conscious principle, the same in kind that man possesses, but feebler in degree, nor even by conceding their position of a moral sense, although so far as our present knowledge extends, it is so faintly developed as scarcely to deserve the name. Man, at least, should neither admit nor deny the moral sense to the lower animals because of the supposed bearing of such an admission upon his own relations to the Supreme Being. The question of the degree and kind of their mental endowments should stand upon its own basis and be resolved upon its own merits. I trust the sensibilities of no one will be disturbed by this method of introducing the subject of animal psychology, and that the subject may be considered unaffected by external complications, and be studied independently upon its own authoritative facts. When the Creator brought into existence the various species of animals, he entrusted to each individual being the care of his own life, as a principle of intelligence was indispensable to capacitate each one to maintain and preserve that life. We find each individual endowed with a mental or spiritual essence which is distinct from the body, but associated with it in a mysterious manner. It requires no argument to prove that the mutes possess a principle of intelligence, which performs for them the same office in governing their conduct that the human mind does for man. When the existence of mind in the mutes is recognized, the qualities it manifests become the subject of investigation. As we know nothing of the ultimate nature of the human mind, so in like manner we know nothing of the ultimate nature of the animal mind. But since the former manifests certain faculties as memory, certain passions as anger, certain appetites as hunger, and puts forth a certain power, the will, the true inquiry is whether the latter manifests certain faculties as memory, certain passions as anger, certain appetites as hunger, and puts forth a certain power, the will. If the affirmative is found to be true to each of these propositions, then the next question must be whether any difference in kind can be discovered between the memory of a man and the memory of a mute, between the anger of the one and the anger of the other, the hunger of the one and the hunger of the other, or the will of the one and the will of the other, unless some real and determinate difference can be found by which to differentiate the qualities of the animal mind from those of the human mind. It must necessarily follow that the mute and the man are both endowed with a similar mental principle, and that man owes his superior dignity not to the exclusive possession of this principle, but rather to its enjoyment in a higher, more ample, and more distinguishing degree. It is one of the extraordinary features of this divine gift that it is capable of adaptation to so many and to such diversified organisms, and not less remarkable that it should still reveal the fundamental similarities of a common principle through all its ramifications, so far as we are able to observe its manifestations. Our knowledge of the lives of the higher animals is extremely limited and founded upon observation alone, while of the inferior species it is next to nothing. The discussion of the subject of animal psychology is therefore necessarily limited to the higher animals and to such facts with reference to these as are well authenticated and universally admitted. Any argument which passes beyond the range of ascertained facts is incapable of proving or disproving any proposition. Neither is it desirable to perplex ourselves with the question whether or not the mutes possess a conscience or the moral sense. While a negative declaration proves nothing, an affirmative assertion is without support in existing knowledge. The prior question, in point of time, is concerning their mental endowments. It is equally unnecessary to discuss the grounds of the artificial distinction which is made between the appetites and passions on the one hand and the intellectual powers on the other. The concession of the former to the mutes in common with mankind, and the withholding of the latter as an independent and distinguishing gift, is an assumption which tends to mislead without advancing the true inquiry. The passion of anger and the pain of hunger can only be predicated of a mental principle, of which they are manifestations as absolutely as memory or imagination. Indeed, it is an axiom in moral as well as in intellectual science that pain and pleasure are experienced in the mind and not in the organs of the body. When, therefore, we find the phenomena of pleasure and pain displayed by individuals of every species, and to be essentially the same in kind among them all, it leads to the same general conclusion, namely, that all living creatures possess a similar mental principle. This leaves the question of difference in degree, which was rendered necessary by difference in species. I propose to submit in a brief form a series of considerations or arguments based upon the structural organization and authenticated acts of the higher animals, tending to show, first, that they possess a mental principle, secondly, that the qualities which it manifests are essentially the same as those displayed by the human mind, and lastly, that the difference between these qualities and inferentially between the principles they respectively represent is one of degree and not of kind. The discussion, to be brief, must necessarily be general, and it is entered upon rather for the purpose of offering suggestions upon branches of the subject than of treating it systematically as a whole. I have neither the facts nor the ability to prepare a treatise upon this important but difficult theme. 1. Structural organization. It has been demonstrated by anatomical comparisons that the structural organization of the vertebrate animals conforms to a general plan. the fundamental features of which run through all the species, genera, orders, and classes of this branch of the animal kingdom. The several species thus stand in fixed relations to each other, and are all bound together by the common creative thought which is incorporated in the diversified forms of the individual representatives of each. Man, therefore, is not permitted to overlook the fact that he is a constituent member of this vertebrate branch, and although endowed, relatively, with the highest capabilities and invested with the highest organization, he cannot free himself from the bond by which its several members are indissolubly united. Among the conspicuous features of this plan of structure is the brain, which is enveloped in a skull and placed in immediate connection with the organ of sense. The nervous system, of which the brain is the center, is universally regarded as the seat of the mental principle. Since all the vertebrate animals possess both the one and the other, they are all alike raised to the first condition necessary for the manifestation of intelligence. In the next place, they all agree in the possession of the organ of vision, located in the head in immediate connection with the brain, of the organs for smelling and hearing, with the exception perhaps of some species, similarly placed, and holding similar relations to the brain. Besides these are the senses of taste and touch. These several senses, operating through similar mechanisms, have but one office, that of communicating impressions of external objects to the brain for the information of the mental principle. By their means, a second condition of intelligence is secured, namely perception. Without one or more of these senses, which are the instruments of perception, the bare continuance of animal life would be impossible, and yet without the presence of a mental principle to take cognizance of the impressions thus conveyed, their object would necessarily be defeated. These intimacies of structure are particularly remarkable among the mammals. The office and function of the several bones and muscles of the animal frame are much the same in the different species. So the nervous system, which is centralized in the brain, is distributed throughout the body in such a manner that the relative position as well as functions of its several parts are similar, if not precisely the same, in all. The several ganglia are found in the same connection with the nerves of sensation and of motion, and performing the same offices in a similar manner. Such minute differences as exist find their explanation in the special adaptation of each animal to his sphere of life. In like manner, the circulating system is constructed upon the same general plan, employing the same organs, with slight variations of form. The same is equally true of the organs of respiration and of the digestive apparatus. One nomenclature suffices for the minutest subdivisions of the mammalian form. The anatomist traces with facility this conformity of structure through all the diversities which specific difference creates. Such modifications of particular organs as occur are seen to be necessary to meet special exigencies, such, for example, as relate to subsistence and to motion. Thus, the organs of respiration admit of considerable diversity in size and form, according to the amount they are required to furnish. Birds need a large quantity of respiration to give their muscles the strength and to their bodies the lightness necessary to flight, whence they have not only a double circulation of the blood and an aerial respiration, but they also respire by other cavities besides the lungs. In most animals, the quantity of respiration is moderate, because they are formed to walk rather than to run. In reptiles, which are formed to creep or hop, it is lower still, while in fishes it is least of all, since they are suspended in a medium of nearly their own specific gravity, and require but little muscular strength for motion. These differences are chiefly produced by variations of the same organs. From the fact that the vertebrate animals share a common typical structure, a strong presumption arises that they also share a common principle of intelligence. This presumption is materially strengthened by other considerations. The structure of the higher animals leads directly to the inference that each of their organic forms was designed to be actuated and governed by a thinking principle, a principle not only capable of receiving impressions conveyed by the organs of sense, but also of making a rational use of the perceptions which these organs were designed to throw perpetually under its cognizance. To deny the existence of the principle, or its power to act, is a denial of the obvious purpose of the elaborate mechanism of the animal frame. From every point in which the structural relations of the vertebrate animals are considered, a common plan of creation is not only seen, but this in turn becomes deeply significant upon the question of similar mental endowments. These intimacies of structure are the foundation of corresponding intimacies in the principle of intelligence by which they are actuated. 2. The principle of life. Life in all its forms is a mystery. As a formative power, it builds up the infantile body from weakness into maturity and strength. It maintains a perpetual conflict with the elements of disorder and decay until the organism in which it dwells breaks up or wears itself out. Is death the destruction of this principle? Or is it immaterial and expelled like the spirit from the body? If it be a principle and therefore immaterial, it would be difficult to show that the living and thinking principles are separate and distinct entities. It seems to be more than surmisable that the two are identical. It is I, the spirit, which lives, and not the body, which is material. If life comes of the union of body and spirit, then it is not an entity, but a result. And all there is of life is the life of the spiritual essence, or of the principle of intelligence. Vegetable life cannot be compared with animal, because the former, to omit other differences, is without self-consciousness. Will it be said that the mutes are without consciousness? It is answered that consciousness is an inseparable and essential quality of the mental principle. When a beaver stands for a moment and looks upon his work, evidently to see whether it is right and whether anything else is needed, he shows himself capable of holding his thoughts before his beaver mind. In other words, he is conscious of his own mental processes. The possession of the principle of life by the higher animals, from its most robust to its most sensitive forms, draws after it whatever this principle may represent. 3. Memory. The mind is known by its qualities exclusively. As a principle or essence, it is not divisible into parts, or faculties, or organs, each having an independent existence. The utmost ingenuity, says Abercrombie, has not been able to advance a step beyond the fact that the mind remembers, reasons, imagines, and there we must rest contented. It cannot for a moment be doubted that the animal mind remembers, and that it displays this quality as purely and as absolutely as the human mind. Memory, then, must be conceded to be one of its qualities. Its quickness or slowness, its retentiveness or weakness are wholly immaterial. It is sufficient that the animal mind is able to recall a former perception or previously known fact, and to have treasured it during the interval. The inference that follows from the recognized possession of a principle capable of remembering is very important. Memory is one of the qualities by which the existence of the human mind is demonstrated. By the same quality, the existence of a corresponding principle in the mutes is also established. If a comparison of the two acts of remembrance show them to be in all respects similar, then the two principles of which they are manifestations are inferentially the same in kind. The difference is indeed immense between the memory of a familiar object, or even of a series of antecedent facts which a mute may exhibit, and that powerful memory in man, which not only is able to hold the facts of universal knowledge, but also to reproduce the process of reasoning, by which the great truths of science have been demonstrated. This difference, however, is immaterial, since it is one of degree and not of kind. As there is a gradation of its power among the individuals of the human species, so there is undoubtedly a similar gradation among the several species of the vertebrate animals. Memory, says Sir William Hamilton, is an immediate knowledge of a present thought, involving an absolute belief that this thought represents another set of knowledge that has been. As the mind is a unit, the whole mind remembers, and not one of its fractional parts. If the power to remember were removed from the mental principle, it would become powerless, and perhaps be overthrown. The past in such a case would be utterly lost, the present vanishing with every instant, the future inconceivable, and the external world a blank. On the other hand, let any created being possess, in addition to the senses, a something capable of remembering, and it has more than the power to remember. It has with it a capacity to know, to understand, and to reason. That something is the mental principle. Every other inference is excluded. Knowing the qualities of this principle as it exists in the human species, and conscious of its unique and extraordinary character, when we find the mutes in possession of a something which displays the same qualities, the philosophical axiom at once suggests itself, namely, that a plurality of principles is not to be assumed, when the phenomena can possibly be explained by one. 4. Reason or judgment. The mutes perceive external objects in the same manner that we do. After admitting that no distinction can be found between their manner and our own of acquiring a knowledge of external things through the organs of sense, it has been denied that they are able to make a rational use of the perceptions thus obtained. Their acts, in innumerable instances, are seen to be acts of intelligence and knowledge, such as a man would perform under similar circumstances, and yet there is an unwillingness to recognize in them the results of deliberate processes of reasoning, followed by an exercise of the will. A large class, it is true, acknowledge some reasoning powers in the mutes, but under such qualifications, limitations, and restrictions, that in effect it denies to them the possession of a free intelligence. The real question is practically evaded. Their acts should be tested by the same analysis which is applied to human acts, and full credence be given to the results. As we cannot place ourselves in personal connection with the animal mind, and thus obtain their testimony concerning their mental processes, we are remitted to their personal acts. Upon these, however, a judgment can be formed as definitely as one man can pronounce upon the act of another man. While this method is not as irrefragable as an appeal to consciousness, it is one upon which mankind act implicitly in their own affairs. Reason, says Abercrombie, consists in comparing and weighing facts, considerations, and motives, and deducing from them conclusions, both as principles of belief and rules of conduct. It is the exercise of mind by which we compare facts with each other, and mental impressions with external things. There are many simple forms of reasoning, such as the relation of cause and effect, the comparison of one fact with another, and drawing an inference therefrom. and the separate consideration of the several qualities of an object. It will be sufficient for the present purpose to take a few of the more simple acts of animal intelligence and test them by the ordinary standards by which human reasoning is measured and determined. Anecdotes of the intelligent conduct of animals are innumerable. They are not only constantly appearing and arresting attention, but a sufficient number of instances to illustrate the subject are within the personal knowledge of every individual. It will not be necessary, therefore, to seek a large number of cases, or to choose such as are the most remarkable. Such only will be selected as tend to illustrate particular forms of reasoning. It is said that a dog, when attempting to track his master by the scent of his footsteps, will, if he finds the road branching, turn up one branch, and failing to find his scent, will then return and go up the other without putting his nose to the ground. It shows he drew the inference that because he did not take the one branch, he must necessarily have taken the other. The act being conceded, the interpretation given becomes an unavoidable conclusion. Again, a dog will open a gate with his paw, a self-taught act. From the fact that he applied the means to effect the end, the inference arises necessarily that he understood the connection between the means and the end. This is pure and simple a case of reasoning, and more than that, a kind of reason which can only be predicated of a thinking principle. The following artifice for catching fish, resorted to by the tiger of the Amazon, is related by Herndon. It involves the same form of reasoning, but covers a wider range of facts. An enormous tiger, he remarks, was extended full length upon a rock, level with the water, about 40 paces from me. From time to time he struck the water with his tail, and at the same moment raised one of his forepaws and seized a fish, often of an enormous size. These last, deceived by the noise, and taking for it the fall of fresh fruit, of which they are very fond, unsuspectingly approach, and soon fall into the claws of the trader. This self-taught device, founded upon a practical knowledge of the habits of fish, displays the operation of unfettered reason. If an analysis of the act were made for the purpose of discovering the mental processes involved, the formula and the result would be precisely the same as if it had been a human act. Reasoning upon the relations of causation must be of perpetual recurrence in the lives of animals. It is not conceivable that they could maintain their existence from day to day without this mental power. Dr. Kane relates a somewhat similar artifice of his dog Grim to escape duty in harness. Grim, he says, was an ancient dog. His teeth indicated many winters, and his limbs, once splendid tractors for the sledge, were now covered with warts and ring-bones. Somehow or other, when the dogs were harnessing for a journey, old Grim was sure not to be found, and upon one occasion, when he was detected in hiding away in a cast-off barrel, he incontinently became lame. Strange to say, he has been lame ever since, except when the team is away without him. How came Grim, it may be asked, to understand the relation between sound legs and the sledge, and beyond that, to feign lameness as an excuse from duty? To reach this final device required a lengthy process of reasoning, as well as a recognition of the sense and justice of his master, upon both of which he intended an imposition. To say the least, these acts transcend the supposable powers of an agent which performs ignorantly and blindly a work of intelligence and knowledge. They can only be explained as the operations of a free intelligence. The works of the Beaver afford many interesting illustrations of his intelligence and reasoning capacity. Felling a tree to reach its branches, involves a series of considerations of a striking character. A beaver, seeing a birch tree full of spreading branches, which to his longing eyes seem quite desirable, may be supposed to say within himself, "If I cut this tree through with my teeth it will fall, and then I can secure its limbs for my winter subsistence." But it is necessary that he should carry his thinking beyond this stage, and ascertain whether it is sufficiently near to his pond, or to some canal connected therewith, to enable him to transport the limbs, when cut into lengths, to the vicinity of his lodge. A failure to cover these contingencies would involve him in a loss of his labor. The several acts here described have been performed by beavers over and over again. They involve, as well as prove, a series of reasoning processes undistinguishable from similar processes of reasoning performed by the human mind. Again, the construction of a canal from the pond across the lowlands to the rising ground, upon which the hard wood is found, to provide a way for the transportation of this wood by water, is another remarkable act of animal intelligence. A canal is not absolutely necessary to beavers any more than such a work is to mankind, but it comes to both alike as the result of progress in knowledge. A beaver canal could only be conceived by a lengthy and even complicated process of reasoning. After the conception had been developed and executed in one place, the selection of a line for a canal in another would involve several distinct considerations, such as the character of the ground to be excavated, its surface elevation above the level of the pond, and the supply of hard wood near its necessary terminus. These, together with many other elements of fitness, must be ascertained to concur before the work could be safely entered upon. When a comparison of a large number of these beaver canals has demonstrated that they were skillfully and judiciously located, the inference seems to be unavoidable that the advantages named were previously ascertained. This would require an exercise of reason in the ordinary acceptation of the term. And this leads to another suggestion. Upon the upper Missouri these canals are impossible from the height of the river banks, and besides this they are unnecessary, as the cottonwood, which is the prevailing tree, is found to the edge of the river. While therefore canals are unknown to the Missouri beavers, they are constantly in use among the beavers of Lake Superior. On the other hand, the beaver slides, so common and so necessary on the upper Missouri, are unnecessary, and therefore unknown, in the Lake Superior region. Contrary to the common opinion, is there not some evidence of a progress in knowledge to be found in the Beaver Canal and the Beaver Slide? There was a time, undoubtedly, when the canal first came into use, and a time, consequently, when it was entirely unknown. Its first introduction was an act of progress from a lower to a higher artificial state of life. The use of the slide tends to show the possession of a free intelligence, by means of which they are enabled to adapt themselves to the circumstances by which they are surrounded. In like manner, it has been seen that the lodge is not constructed upon an invariably typical plan, but adapted to the particular location in which it is placed. The lake, the island, and the bank lodge are all different from each other, and the differences consist in changes of form to meet the exigencies of the situation. These several artificial works show a capacity in the beaver to adapt his constructions to the particular conditions in which he finds himself placed. Whether or not they evince progress in knowledge, they at least show that the beaver follows, in these respects, the suggestions of a free intelligence. Instinct, says Dr. Reed, is the habitual power of producing effects like contrivances of reason, yet so far beyond the intelligence and experience of the agent as to be wholly unexplainable by reference to them. Habitual acts can only be understood from human experience. Acts to be performed habitually or mechanically must first be learned by an exercise of intelligence. It is a very unsatisfactory explanation of the works of a beaver to affirm that he was endowed at his birth with a mechanical skill which, by the laws of mind, must be acquired by experience. An assertion that the acts of a beaver in felling a tree, in constructing a dam, or in excavating a canal are beyond his intelligence is mere assumption as well as a contradiction of terms. This conclusion flows legitimately from the original blunder of attempting arbitrarily to endow animals with a supernatural principle which enables them to perform ignorantly and blindly works of intelligence and knowledge. While this mysterious agent performs its office intelligently, the animal is a mere machine, according to the theory of Descartes. In other words, he is made a dwelling for a principle of intelligence, but this principle being superior to, and in some way independent of, the mute, holds no other relation to him than that of master and guide. Can anything be found in the whole range of human speculation more feeble than this expedient of human reason to explain a class of phenomena as simple as the simplest in the natural world? The practice of beavers, while moving their short cuttings by water, of placing one end against the throat and pushing it from behind, of carrying mud and stones under their throats, holding them there with the paws, and of packing mud upon their lodges and dams by a stroke of the tail, have elsewhere been explained. They are severally intelligent acts, performed sensibly and rationally. Their method of shoving or rolling the larger billets of wood with their hips is even more ingenious. The little ants resort to a similar expedient to move bits of grain, but shove them with their shoulders. Their ingenuity and intelligence attracted the attention of ancient observers, several of whom recognized in them the possession of a mental principle. Cicero says of the ant, who excels the beaver in systematic industry, "In formicam non modo sensus, sed etiam mens, ratio memoria." Personal labor of every kind and description depends upon, as well as evinces, the continuous operation of a mental principle. Many animals, among which the beaver and the ant are good examples, provide a store of provisions for their sustenance during winter. This act shows a forecast of the future. To satisfy present hunger is a simple act of intelligence, but to anticipate distant wants and provide for them is a much higher act of knowledge. What motive could induce the mutes to make such provision, unless they knew, or had learned by experience, that winter followed the summer, and that the preservation of their lives required the accumulation of a surplus of food? The possession of a thinking principle renders all these acts perfectly intelligible as well as simple, and without it they are wholly incapable of a rational explanation. End of section 24. Section 25 of The American Beaver and His Works by Lewis Henry Morgan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Deon, Salt Lake City, Utah. Chapter 9, Animal Psychology, Part 2. The beaver, in a comparative estimate, is a low animal in his structural organization, as has been shown. He lives upon the coarsest food, is slow of motion upon land, of low respiration, monotrematus, and aquatic. His vision is short in range, and his brain is without those convolutions which are regarded as indications of mental power. In the great catalogue of animals, which is constructed upon the basis of anatomical structure, he rises no higher than the rat, the porcupine, or the squirrel. There is no reason for supposing that he is more intelligent than any other rodent of a corresponding grade. And yet by his sagacity, his industry, and his artificial erections, he has raised himself to a very respectable position in human estimation for intelligence and architectural capacity. It is because he needs these erections to promote his comfort and safety that man is able to follow the evidences of his skill and intelligence, and to become satisfied of their extraordinary character. If then an animal with such an inferior organization manifests so large an amount of mental capacity, of how much more must those be capable whose organization is found to be so much superior? There is no doubt that the highest forms of intelligence among the mutes are to be found in the carnivorous animals. As an order, they live preeminently by their wits, and they are unquestionably endowed with mental capacities of higher relative power to enable them to maintain their existence. The propagation and perpetuation of their species to the present time testifies to the continuous triumph of their superior intelligence over the feebler capacities of the non-carnivorous mutes upon whom they subsist. They are able to endure hunger and fatigue, to wait and watch for prey, and to invent and practice many artifices for the capture of the latter. Many of them have great physical strength, a large brain, powerful respiration, and remarkable fleetness of foot. Their personal appearance commands both respect and admiration. Who ever looked into the clear, round eye of a lion without being impressed with the thought that there was a quick intelligence and a powerful will behind it, which, in the open plain or in the thicket, it would be hard to deceive and difficult to overmatch? The carnivorous animals construct nothing save a burrow or a den. Their personal acts, which have never been carefully studied, furnish, therefore, the only sources of information concerning their mental endowments. But enough of these have been witnessed and authenticated to illustrate the subject. It will be sufficient for the present purpose to introduce one or two cases. The fox, when pursued, often takes to the bed of a shallow stream to conceal his footprints and suppress his scent, or runs back upon his own track for some distance, and then, making a long leap at a right angle, changes his direction. These devices were well adapted to embarrass and foil his pursuers. It seems to be an unavoidable inference that the fox understood the means by which he was followed, and that he possessed sufficient acuteness, as well as subtlety of mind, to counteract in these ways the danger. These expedients presuppose a consciousness of peril, which of itself involves a knowledge of antecedent occurrences, and the execution of the device shows deliberation, conclusion, and an exercise of the will. The acts themselves are unexplainable, except as manifestations of a free intelligence. This animal, whose cunning is proverbial, has been known to simulate death, to secure his deliverance under circumstances somewhat trying to his fortitude. A fox one night entered the hen-house of a farmer, and after destroying a large number of fowls, gorged himself to such repletion that he could not pass out through the small aperture by which he had entered. The proprietor found him in the morning sprawled out upon the floor, apparently dead from surfeit, and taking him up by the legs, carried him out, unsuspectingly, and for some distance to the side of his house, where he dropped him upon the grass. No sooner did Renard find himself free than he sprang to his feet and made his escape. He seemed to know that it was only as a dead fox that he would be allowed to leave the scene of his spoliations, and yet to devise this plan of escape required no ordinary effort of intelligence, while its execution rather taxes our confidence in his possession of such steadiness of nerves. A man placed in similar circumstances, and resorting to a like expedient, would be conscious of several distinct processes of reasoning. It is difficult to perceive how these processes could be possible in either case, except by the agency of a mental principle, or how they could differ as modes of thought. The several acts of the mutes here cited as illustrations of the exercise of reason can be fully explained as manifestations of a thinking principle. When the possession by them of such a principle is recognized, all difficulties vanish, and their conduct appears in an intelligible light. It also follows that their intelligence must necessarily be free to act within the range of its powers. In this discussion, the relative strength of their mental capacities is left out of view as immaterial. Compared with those of the human intellect, they are feeble and slight, but within their several spheres of life and action they are ample for the promotion of their individual happiness. 5. Imagination. Whether the animal mind exhibits the quality of imagination, it may be difficult to substantiate. Although it is one of the highest qualities of the mental principle, yet it is manifested in many simple forms. The playfulness of childhood, which is also commonly exhibited by the young of animals, is superinduced, seemingly, by the pictures or images formed in the mind by the fancy or imagination. This faculty, Kames observes, is the great instrument of recreation. If an attempt is made to explain the songs of birds, it will be necessary to resort to imagination, since the art itself is imaginative. Animals are known to dream from physical indications during sleep, and dreams are the work of memory and imagination. Too little is known of the lives of animals to show whether they possess this quality to any sensible degree. 6. The will. A doubt has been entertained whether the mutes possess a will, like the will of man, because responsibility must follow its exercise. Their own lives, at least, are entrusted to their keeping, the preservation of which is the highest form of responsibility. With a free volition, they rise up or lie down, they go or come, they play or quarrel, they bark or mew or sing, and they lie in wait for prey or seek it by long excursions. These several acts are performed under the influence of motives, and were preceded by an exercise of the will. Unless the mute has a free choice between alternative courses, one of which may lead to danger and the other to safety, his conduct would be unintelligent. He might lose his life at any moment. The will is that mental power that sets the body in motion to exercise a resolution previously reached by a process of reasoning. It is the power which adopts and executes the conclusion of the judgment. Unless a difference can be discovered in the quality of the will, as displayed by the mutes and by mankind, there is no means of distinguishing one from the other, except in the degree of its strength and persistency. A will also presupposes the existence of a mental principle, of which alone it can be predicated. 7. Appetites and passions. The mutes have the appetites and passions in common with mankind. No difficulty has ever been found in conceding a community of characteristics in these, the inferior manifestations of the mental process, while they differ in the degree of their strength, some of them are undoubtedly wanting among the lowest grades of the vertebrate animals, as a portion of them excel mankind in the acuteness of the senses, by means of which the feebleness of their mental power is supplemented. So in some of the appetites and passion they may possess a delicacy of sensibility of which the human species are incapable. In their affections for their young and for their mates, among such as pair, the highest evidence of their sensibility is found. They also display courage, fidelity, and gratitude, and to these perhaps in some rare instances benevolence may be added. For the possession of these qualities, which are undistinguishable from the corresponding qualities manifested by the human mind, and for the beautiful illustrations of maternal affection which they display, they are entitled to our regard. Captain Stansbury gives the following account of a blind pelican upon one of the islands of the Great Salt Lake of Utah. In a ramble around the shores of the island, I came across a venerable-looking old pelican, very large and fat, which allowed me to approach him without attempting to escape. Surprised at his apparent tameness, we examined him more closely, and found that it was owing to his being entirely blind, for he proved to be very pugnacious, snapping freely, but vaguely on each side, in search of his enemies, whom he could hear, but could not see. As he was totally helpless, he must have subsisted on the charity of his neighbors, and his sleek and comfortable condition showed that, like beggars in more civilized communities, he had fared sumptuously every day. The food of these birds consists entirely of fish, which they must necessarily obtain from Bear River, from the Weber, the Jordan, or from the warm springs on the eastern side of Spring Valley, at all of which places they were observed fishing for food. The nearest of these points was more than 30 miles distant, making necessary a flight of at least 60 miles to procure and transport food for the subsistence of their young. Immense numbers of young birds were huddled together in groups about the island, under the charge of a grave-looking nurse or keeper, who all the time that we were there was relieved from guard at intervals as regularly as a sentinel. Incidents illustrative of this class of qualities could be multiplied to an indefinite extent. They tend to a striking manner to show the uniformity of the operations of the mental principle throughout the animal kingdom. 8. Lunacy of animals. Under the preceding heads we have discussed a small number out of the great body of facts which tend to establish the existence of a thinking, reasoning principle among the mutes, and also tending to show that the qualities manifested by it cannot be distinguished from the corresponding manifestations of the human mind, except in the degree of their strength. Cases have occurred among animals where their mental powers were overthrown and lunacy supervened, furnishing the same external indications which follow the overthrow of the human intellect, so that the animal has been seen in both conditions, when in the full possession of his faculties, and when their functions have been suspended. Dr. Kane relates several cases in point among his dogs, occasioned by the absence of light during the long Arctic winter when he was ice-bound in the far north. He remarks as follows: "The mouse-colored dogs, the leaders of my Newfoundland team, have for the last fortnight been nursed like babies. No one can tell how anxiously I watch them. They are kept below, tended, fed, cleansed, caressed, and doctored, to the infinite discomfort of all hands. Today I give up the last hope of saving them. Their disease is as clearly mental as in the case of any human being. The more material functions of the poor brutes go on without interruption. They eat voraciously, retain their strength, and sleep well, but all the indications beyond this go to prove that the original epilepsy, which was the first manifestation of brain disease among them, has been followed by a true lunacy. They look frenzied at nothing, walk in straight and curved lines with anxious and unwearying perseverance. They fawn on you, but without seeming to appreciate the notice you give them in return, pushing their heads against your person or oscillating with a strange pantomime of fear. Their most intelligent actions seem automatic. Sometimes they claw you as if trying to burrow into your seal skins. Sometimes they remain for hours in moody silence, and then start off howling as if pursued, and run up and down for hours. So it was with poor Flora, our wise dog. She was seized with the endemic spasms, and after a few days of violent paroxysms, lapsed into a lethargic condition, eating voraciously, but gaining no strength. This passing off, the same crazy wildness took possession of her, and she died of brain disease, arachnoidal effusion, in about 6 weeks. This account is so full and specific that it needs no comment. Such a case of lunacy was only needed to complete the analogy which seems to be sustained in every other of the more common manifestations of the animal and of the human mind. From the foregoing, but most incomplete and imperfect consideration of some of the branches of the subject of animal psychology, it would be venturesome to urge any other than the more simple conclusion. 2 or 3 only will be suggested. In the first place, the term instinct, to explain the intelligent acts of animals, should be abandoned. This term was an invention of the metaphysicians to assert and maintain a fundamental distinction between the mental principle of the human species and that of the inferior animals. With its multiform definitions and with the repeated enlargements of its signification, it is wholly incapable of explaining the phenomena of animal intelligence. As a vain attempt to embody a system of philosophy in a definition, it has proved a failure, as might have been expected. When carried to its legitimate results, it endows every animal with a supernatural principle, and makes each of his intelligent acts little short of a miracle. As a term or invention, it is functus officio. With its disuse, the subject of animal psychology is freed from all extraneous embarrassments, and the mental phenomena manifested by the mutes can be investigated and explained on philosophical principles. In the second place, we are led to recognize in the mutes the possession of a free intelligence. In other words, that they are endowed with a mental principle which performs for them the same office that the human mind does for man. That this principle is free to act in view of motives and premises, and that it is ample in measure to enable each animal within its sphere of action to preserve his life and govern his conduct. This conclusion seems necessarily to follow from their possession of the organs of sense, from their manifestation of the appetites and passions, and from their ability to perceive, to remember, to reason, and to will. And in the third and last place, as we are unable in similar specific acts to find any difference in kind between the manifestations of perception, appetite, and passion, memory, reason, and will on the part of a mute, and the corresponding manifestations on the part of a man, we are led to the conclusion that the difference is one of degree and not of kind, and therefore that the principle from which they emanate is the same in kind, but bestowed in different measure, to adapt each species to its particular mode of life. This theory, when rightly considered, is neither novel nor subversive of moral truth. The general intelligence of mankind, which embodies, in a greater degree than is usually supposed, the highest sense of the human understanding, never adopted the speculations of the metaphysicians with reference to the endowments of the inferior animals. On the contrary, it has ever been disposed to recognize in them the possession of a rational thinking principle, as free to act as the mind of man. To this view later writers are drawing sensibly nearer. Among the number, Max Müller has quite recently put forth some very sensible observations. I mean, he remarks, to claim a large share of what we call our mental faculties for the higher animals. These animals have sensation, perception, memory, will, and intellect. Only we must restrict intellect to the interlacing of single perceptions. All these points can be proved by irrefragable evidence. There are no doubt many people who are as much frightened at the idea that brutes have souls as by the blue ape without a tail. It does not follow that brutes have no souls because they have no human souls. It does not follow that the souls of men are not immortal because the souls of animals are not immortal. Nor has the major premise ever been proved by any philosopher, namely that the souls of brutes must necessarily be destroyed and annihilated by death. Leibniz, who has defended the immortality of the human soul with stronger arguments than even Descartes, writes, I found at last how the souls of brutes and their sensations do not at all interfere with the immortality of human souls. On the contrary, nothing seems better to establish our natural immortality than to believe that all souls are imperishable. To nearly the same effect, Agassiz had previously expressed himself. When animals fight with each other, he says, when they associate for a common purpose, when they warn one another in danger, when they come to the rescue of one another, when they display pain or joy, they manifest impulses of the same kind as are considered among the moral attributes of man. The range of the passions is even as extensive as that of the human mind, and I am at a loss to perceive a difference in kind between them, however much they may differ in degree, and in the manner in which they are expressed. This argues strongly in favor of the existence in every animal of an immaterial principle similar to that which, by its excellence and superior endowments, places man so much above animals. Yet the principle exists unquestionably, and whether it be called soul, reason, or instinct, it presents in the whole range of organized beings a series of phenomena closely linked together, and upon it are based not only the highest manifestations of mind, but the very permanence of the specific differences which characterize every organism. Most of the arguments of philosophy in favor of the immortality of man apply to the permanence of this principle in other living beings. With 2 or 3 further suggestions, this discussion will be concluded. It cannot be said that the views herein presented tend to lower the personal dignity of man, but on the contrary, they rather serve to distinguish his position. His great superiority is abundantly assured by the bestowment of the highest structural organization, of the fullest mental endowments, and by the possession of articulate speech. The distance which separates him from the highest of the mutes is sufficiently immeasurable to relieve his pride from all sense of humiliation, from the consciousness of sharing the principle of intelligence with the latter. Sidney Smith has touched this point with his satirical pen in the following language. I confess I feel myself so much at ease about the superiority of mankind. I have such a marked and decided contempt for the understanding of every baboon I have ever seen. I feel so sure that the blue ape without a tail will never rival us in poetry, painting, and music. that I see no reason whatever that justice may not be done to the few fragments of soul and tatters of understanding which they may really possess. The mental principle here derided, while its possession is admitted, has nevertheless the inherent dignity of which a thinking principle cannot be divested. By his preeminent endowments, man stands at the head of the animal kingdom, the great exemplar of this principle, and separated by a wide interval from its other possessors. The separation is as marked and real as could be desired, but it is doubtful whether he possesses the sum of the powers of the principle called mind. It is precisely here, as it seems to the writer, that God has revealed a feature in the plan of creation not less wonderful than the original conception of a mental principle. Having called into existence this marvelous principle and created a series of organic forms, he apportioned it among them all in such measure as to adapt each individual being to the sphere of life in which he was designed to move. The widest possible range for the exercise and development of the mind was thus provided. A full comprehension of its powers and capacities must therefore be sought in its varied manifestations by the several species. It is not probable that the whole of its powers are possessed by any species, but rather that in their totality they are to be found among the members of the animal kingdom as a whole. A true system of mental philosophy, therefore, cannot be developed until all the manifestations of this principle are comprehended. The hiatus between man and the nearest species below him in the scale of intelligence is so wide as to disturb the symmetrical gradation of the several orders of animals. We can neither conjecture that some intermediate order has fallen out of existence, nor assume the permanent degradation of any existing species. But, on the contrary, it seems to have been a part of the original plan of creation that man should stand without a compeer or contestant, the indisputable head of the series of organic forms, and the recipient in the largest measure of the gift of the mental principle. Some explanation of his excessive superiority may be found in the progress he has made since his emergence from his primitive condition. For ages, the bounds of which are unknown, mankind were immersed in a barbarism the depths of which can be but feebly conceived. They were without arts, without agriculture, without flocks or herds, depending chiefly upon fish and the spontaneous fruits of the earth for subsistence. There are glimpses afforded to us here and there of a state of society in which the family relations were unknown, and in which violence and passion reigned supreme. The contrast between such a condition of mankind and that of the present time is so great that it is difficult to recognize in these primitive barbarians our lineal progenitors. Out of that condition man has struggled through a long and painful experience, until he has been finally rewarded with the amenities of civilization. Language has been the great instrument of this progress, the power of which has increased many-fold when it clothed itself in written characters. He was thus enabled to perpetuate the results of individual experience and transmit them through the ages. Each discovery thus became a foundation on which to mount up to new discoveries. With the knowledge he has gained and the elevation he has experienced, it is now difficult to realize the low condition from which his line of advancement commenced. Portions of the human family are still found in the darkness of ignorance and in the feebleness of mental imbecility, and yet, although the distance of their intellectual separation is very great, it is much less than that between the latter and the most intelligent of the inferior animals. The difference expresses the superiority of his structural organization and of his mental endowments. On the other hand, can it be truly affirmed that the inferior animals have been stationary in their knowledge from the commencement of their existence? This conclusion should not be over hastily assumed. Within the period of human observation, their progress has seemed to be inconsiderable, but yet not absolutely nothing. For example, dogs under training have developed special capacities, such as the pointer and the setter, and have transmitted them to their offspring. This shows not only progress, but that of so marked a character as to work a transformation in the characteristics of the animal. Many animals, as the elephant, the horse, the bear, and even the hog, the type of stupidity, have been taught a variety of performances under the stimulus of rewards, of which they were previously ignorant. These examples, however, are less important than the knowledge acquired by undomesticated animals and transmitted as a part of their experience and knowledge in the species in which they were acquired. Of this kind are the several varieties of the beaver lodge and dam, and the development and perpetuation of the idea of a beaver canal. When careful and patient investigation has been made of these several subjects, the results will materially modify, in all probability, our present impressions. Finally, is it to be the prerogative of man to uproot and destroy not only the masses of the animal kingdom numerically, but also the great body of the species? If the human family maintains its present hostile attitude toward the mutes and increases in numbers and in civilization at the present ratio for several centuries to come, it is plain to be seen that many species of animals must be extirpated from the earth. An arrest of the progress of the human race can alone prevent this dismemberment and destruction of a large portion of the animal kingdom. Domestication or extermination is the alternative already offered not alone to species, but to families and orders of animals. It may be that this result was never intended in the counsels of Providence. It is not unlikely that God has adjusted a balance among the several orders of animals which cannot be overthrown except at the peril of the aggressor, and that in some mysterious way this balance is destined to be preserved. The present attitude of man toward the mutes is not such, in all respects, as befits his superior wisdom. We deny them all rights, and ravage their ranks with wanton and unmerciful cruelty. The annual sacrifice of animal life to maintain human life is frightful, if considered only with reference to its excess beyond our reasonable wants. When the Creator made man omnivorous, he designed his use of animal food. It is not sentimentalism, but rather sense, to say that he should exercise the right with reason and forbearance. When we claim that the bear was made for man's food, we forget that man was just as much made to be food for the bear, and that our right to eat the bear rests upon no higher sanction than his co-equal right to feast upon our flesh if he overcomes in battle. Man's dominion over the mutes is in virtue of his superior endowments, but it is equally clear that the great author of existence designed the happiness of the smallest and least endowed of all his creatures as completely and as absolutely as he did the happiness of man. If we recognize the fact that the mutes possess a thinking and reasoning and perhaps an immortal principle, our relations to them will appear to us in a different and in a better light. End of section 25. End of The American Beaver and His Works by Lewis Henry Morgan.